In December 1941, when Japanese aircraft swept across the skies above Pearl Harbor, the world believed the Empire of Japan had unleashed a force of terrifying precision. The attack seemed proof that Japanese technology, discipline, and training had reached perfection. For a brief moment, the rising sun appeared unstoppable. But beneath the triumph lay a fatal illusion, one born not of arrogance alone, but of a misunderstanding of how war itself had changed. Japan entered the Pacific War at the peak of what its admirals called the decisive battle doctrine, a vision forged from Tsushima Strait in 1905, where Japan's modern fleet had annihilated the Russian Navy through gunnery skill and disciplined maneuver. To the Imperial Japanese Navy, victory at sea came from mastery of tactics, not machinery. Officers trained for decades to perfect the art of range finding, formation control, and torpedo attack. Yet by 1941, the very foundation of that doctrine was already obsolete. The United States and Britain had quietly replaced intuition with instrumentation. Radar, sonar, and electromechanical fire control computers were spreading through every ship class. In Japanese eyes, these devices were curiosities, useful perhaps, but secondary to human skill. The Navy that struck Pearl Harbor carried the finest optical rangefinders in existence, but only a handful of primitive radars. Even those were installed as afterthoughts, not as integral parts of a combat system. The Empire had entered an electronic war while still fighting an optical one. The contrast widened almost immediately. In the first months after Pearl Harbor, Japanese carrier groups dominated the Pacific with audacious raids, Rabaul, Darwin, Ceylon, while American forces reeled. Yet in every engagement, American engineers and analysts studied each defeat, adapting faster than Japan could comprehend. The Americans treated every battle as a laboratory. Japanese commanders treated every battle as a test of courage. By mid-1942, that difference in philosophy began to surface as a measurable gap. When the Japanese fleet sailed toward Midway in June, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto believed he was executing a masterpiece of deception. He had calculated every move according to the traditional logic of Mahanian naval warfare. But the Americans no longer relied on guesswork. They relied on data. The codebreakers of Station Hypo had already read Japan's plans. American task forces positioned themselves precisely where Yamamoto expected them least. The battle that followed was not a contest of courage, but of comprehension. The destruction of 4 Japanese carriers at Midway marked more than a tactical catastrophe. It marked the moment when Japan's pre-war philosophy collided with industrial modernity. The Imperial Navy still possessed elite pilots and crews, but their replacements could not be trained fast enough. The American Navy, by contrast, was already applying assembly line methods to training and production alike. Within months, the first wave of new Essex-class carriers began construction. Every yard on the American coast roared with welding torches, while Japan's shipyards struggled even to repair damage. By 1943, the technological disparity had become systemic. American fleet operations relied increasingly on radar coordination. Destroyers could fight at night with radar-directed gunnery. Carriers launched aircraft guided by radar vectors from combat information centers. Submarines attacked convoys under cover of darkness, tracking by radar when periscopes were blind. Japanese forces, deprived of equivalent instruments, continued to fight by sight and paid the price in blood. When Japanese officers captured fragments of American radar after early battles, they recognized its value but could not reproduce it. Japan's electronics industry lacked the vacuum tube production capacity and precision machining required. Each Japanese radar set was practically hand-built, unreliable, and incompatible with others. American sets were standardized, interchangeable, and mass-produced. This difference, one of system, not skill, was what doomed Japan's Navy long before the last torpedo struck. Admiral Ugaki Matome, Yamamoto's chief of staff, later wrote in his war diary that by late 1943, he felt as though the Japanese fleet was fighting blindfolded. He was not being metaphorical. During night engagements off the Solomon Islands, American destroyers opened fire from beyond visual range, guided by radar plots. Japanese gunners responded to muzzle flashes they could barely see. In one infamous action, the battleship Kirishima was torn apart in 7 minutes by radar-directed salvos from USS Washington, a duel so one-sided that observers compared it not to battle but to execution. The tragedy for Japan was that its officers understood their predicament but could not change it. The empire's industrial system was rigid, compartmentalized, and bound by bureaucracy. Shipyards operated under peacetime standards. Factories prioritized craftsmanship over quantity. Engineers were reluctant to simplify designs for mass production, fearing a loss of honor in inferior workmanship. In contrast, American manufacturers like Bethlehem Steel and Newport News streamlined every process. The result was exponential divergence. By 1944, the United States was launching a new fleet carrier every 2 months, while Japan struggled to complete one. Fuel shortages compounded the crisis. The embargo that had triggered Pearl Harbor now strangled Japan's mobility. Without oil, training flights dwindled. Destroyers remained in port. Radar experiments stalled for lack of generator fuel. American carrier groups, fueled by Persian Gulf crude and Pacific convoys, operated with impunity across thousands of miles. The Japanese Navy, once master of long-range strategy, was reduced to defending shrinking perimeters it could barely patrol. Inside Tokyo's naval staff offices, the debates grew desperate. Younger officers demanded reform. More radar, more training, more integration of air and surface forces. Older admirals clung to the decisive battle dream. The bureaucratic inertia proved fatal. By the time Japan began serious mass production of air search radar in 1944, the Americans were already fielding second-generation microwave sets that could detect a periscope's wake at 20 miles. The gap had grown from 2 years to nearly 5. Meanwhile, American industrial might was transforming the very architecture of warfare. New radar-equipped destroyers served as pickets for carrier groups, extending detection ranges far beyond visual limits. Escort carriers, small, inexpensive, and numerous, provided air cover for every convoy and amphibious landing. Japanese naval doctrine, still centered on decisive fleet engagements, had no answer. Their fleets were built for the grand duel that never came. Instead, they were dissected piece by piece by a relentless, invisible enemy. Admiral Shoji Nishimura's fate at Surigao Strait in October 1944 symbolized the end of that era. His squadron sailed through the darkness, unaware that American radar screens tracked every movement. The battle that followed was not fought. It was performed, a textbook crossing of the T executed with electronic precision. In less than half an hour, the Japanese force ceased to exist. Observers later described it as the first true machine-age naval battle, where computers, not commanders, decided the outcome. For the Americans, These victories were not simply tactical. They were proof that technology could compensate for uncertainty. Each engagement reinforced faith in radar, logistics, and computation. For Japan, each defeat deepened reliance on spirit and sacrifice, the only resources still abundant. By 1945, that faith in spiritual warfare manifested as kamikaze attacks. Pilots were told that their courage could equal the enemy's machinery. But even supreme courage could not bridge a technological chasm. The tragedy of Japan's Navy was not its lack of bravery, but its inability to adapt. Its admirals had studied Nelson, Mahan, and Tsushima, but not Bell Labs, MIT, or RCA. The Americans fought with circuits. Japan fought with tradition. One nation embraced the age of electrons, the other worshipped the age of optics. And in that contrast, the fate of an empire was sealed. By the end of 1944, Japanese naval intelligence estimated that American radar and fire control systems were at least 5 years ahead. What they did not realize was that the gap was still widening. Every battle pushed American engineers to refine, miniaturize, and integrate. Japan's scientists worked in isolation, without the industrial base to turn prototypes into fleets. The result was predictable. By the time Japan deployed a working system, the Americans had already moved on. Even so, the human element never disappeared. Japanese sailors continued to fight with extraordinary discipline. Crews died at their guns rather than abandon ship. But bravery could no longer decide the outcome. The war had become a contest of production rates and signal frequencies, a war measured not in courage, but in cycles per second. As 1945 dawned, Japan's admirals faced the inevitable. The empire that had once dreamed of ruling the Pacific now fought merely to delay defeat. The oceans that had once shielded Japan became highways for American task forces. Radar-guided bombers struck industrial centers with impunity. The once mighty combined fleet was reduced to fragments, scattered across the inland sea. And yet, within those last ships and desperate crews, there lingered a haunting awareness. They were witnessing the end of an age, the end of the sailors' war, replaced forever by the engineers' war. The winter of 1944 brought with it a bitter reckoning for Germany. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last gamble in the West, began with dramatic success. German forces achieved total tactical surprise, pushing Allied lines back through the frozen Ardennes. For a few days, it seemed possible that armored divisions might pierce through to the Meuse River, splitting the Allied armies and changing the war's momentum. But even amid the chaos, the American military machine began to assert itself. Supplies, ammunition, and equipment flowed seamlessly, a testament to a logistic system that Germany could not replicate. And at the center of that system stood an unassuming yet devastating weapon, the M2 Browning 50 caliber machine gun. American infantry carried these guns into the snow-covered forests of Belgium and Luxembourg, their weight heavy but manageable for a trained crew. Even hastily constructed defensive positions could unleash torrents of fire, cutting down advancing German infantry with terrifying efficiency. In Bastogne, surrounded units relied on these heavy machine guns to hold positions that would have otherwise fallen. Freezing temperatures, mud, and the chaos of battle did nothing to hinder them. German planners had made one critical miscalculation. They assumed that the harsh winter would ground American air support and neutralize their firepower. They were only partially correct. While snow and fog limited airstrikes temporarily, They could not stop ground-mounted 50 caliber guns, nor could they diminish the Americans' logistical capacity to supply ammunition at astonishing rates. By early 1945, even experienced German officers recognized the psychological impact of these guns. General Durfallam Troop Alfred Schley, commanding the 1st Parachute Army, observed that his troops instinctively feared the unmistakable staccato report of the M2. Any movement could draw instant fire. No countermeasure existed. This constant threat created a defensive mindset that sapped initiative and slowed advances, even when manpower remained sufficient. The technical specifications of the M2 reveal why it was so effective. Weighing 84 pounds without a tripod and 128 pounds with the M3 mount, the weapon could engage targets up to 1,830 meters away, far beyond the reach of most German rifles and light machine guns. It fired between 450 and 575 rounds per minute. Its ammunition included specialized rounds, M33 ball, 2,910 feet per second muzzle velocity, M8 API, penetrated 16mm armor and ignited fuel or ammunition, M20 APIT, penetrated 21mm armor and included a tracer element for fire correction. While the M2 could not destroy the frontal armor of Tigers or Panthers, it shredded half-tracks, trucks, armored cars, and artillery. Engine blocks, fuel tanks, and exposed infantry were all vulnerable. In practice, the M2's real strength was its ubiquity and reliability. Every American combat unit could bring it to bear, anywhere, anytime. John Browning had begun designing the weapon in 1917. The water-cooled M1921 weighed 121 pounds and was too cumbersome for mobile warfare. The air-cooled M2, adopted in 1933, eliminated water jackets while retaining the ruggedness Browning had envisioned. By 1944, merely 2 million 50 caliber guns had been produced across all American services. The heavy-barrel M2HB variant, designed for sustained fire, numbered roughly 350,000 units. By comparison, Germany's MG-34 and MG-42 were highly sophisticated, versatile weapons. The MG-42 could fire up to 1,200 rounds per minute, and the MG-131 aircraft gun reached 900 rounds per minute. Yet speed and sophistication mattered little when German troops were outnumbered, outsupplied, and facing a psychologically overwhelming wall of fire. American doctrine emphasized one principle: suppress and saturate the enemy. Every bomber carried multiple M2s, every fighter included heavy machine guns, and infantry units had organic .50 caliber Keams. Anti-aircraft M16 quad mounts could be repurposed for ground combat. The result was a force multiplier unparalleled in the war. Wherever German soldiers moved, fire followed, relentless and unyielding. This constant presence of fire reshaped the battlefield. Veteran German infantry who had survived the Eastern Front found themselves unwilling to maneuver in daylight. Armored vehicles hugged terrain and cover, cautious to the point of inaction. Tactical initiative shifted permanently to the Americans, not through superior strategy, but through industrial advantage and the calculated expenditure of materials. The resentment German soldiers felt toward the M2 was more than battlefield frustration. It was the resentment of craftsmen forced to fight against mass production. Their elite skills and disciplined methods could not compete with the scale and reliability of American industry. Precision and skill were rendered obsolete in the face of endless, dependable firepower. Post-war analysis confirmed the truth. The M2 was not the fastest, lightest, or most sophisticated weapon of World War II, but it was the most effective because it was reliable, omnipresent, and supported by a system capable of sustaining overwhelming material expenditure. It exemplified the broader philosophy that would decide the war: industrial capacity as a weapon. German officers realized too late that their reliance on training, doctrine, and elite crews could not overcome an enemy willing and able to expend ammunition, manpower, and machinery without hesitation. The lesson was clear. In modern warfare, skill alone could not win battles. What mattered was the ability to sustain firepower continuously across multiple fronts in all conditions. The M2 Browning became a symbol of that principle, a tool of both destruction and deterrence. It prevented advances, destroyed vehicles, and reshaped tactical thinking. 80 years after its introduction, the weapon remains in active service, a testament to its durability, effectiveness, and the foresight of American military planning. By 1945, German military planning had failed to account for the sheer weight of American material power. Tanks, infantry, and aircraft might have been matched by German skill, but the relentless pressure of supply, combined with weapons like the M2, rendered counterattacks nearly impossible. The clash between industrialized warfare and traditional craftsmanship was no longer theoretical. It was written in smoke, metal, and frozen blood across the Ardennes and Rhineland. The Germans brought discipline and strategy. The Americans brought an industrial system that could endure, adapt, and overwhelm. And in that collision, victory had long been decided before the first round of the M2 was even fired. By early 1945, Germany's military situation was deteriorating on every front. The Ardennes offensive had failed. The Red Army was advancing inexorably from the east, and Allied forces were crossing the Rhine in the west. The battlefield now illustrated a fundamental truth: industrial capacity and logistics, not just tactics, determined victory in modern war. German forces were increasingly desperate. Veteran divisions were under strength, equipment was worn, and ammunition was rationed to the point of ineffectiveness. Even elite units, once feared across Europe, were confronting a new reality. American combined arms teams, integrating infantry, armor, artillery, and aircraft, all supported by relentless supply lines, rendered German battlefield experience nearly irrelevant. Air dominance and the decimation from above. One of the most telling examples of American superiority was air power. By 1945, the Allies maintained near-complete control of the skies over Western Europe. Strategic bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator shattered German industrial centers, while tactical aircraft like the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-51 Mustang dominated the battlefield, providing close air support with devastating effectiveness. Every American bomber carried multiple 50-caliber M2 machine guns, creating a defensive shield against Luftwaffe attacks. Yet the same weapons were equally effective against ground targets. German troops on the move faced withering fire from above, and even armored vehicles could not advance without being targeted by strafing runs that disabled engines and punctured fuel tanks. This relentless integration of air and ground firepower created a psychological stranglehold. German soldiers learned that any movement could be fatal. Even the most experienced Panzer crews, who had survived the Eastern Front, found themselves hesitant to maneuver in daylight. Tactical skill mattered little when every decision could be instantly punished by American firepower. Combined arms and the doctrine of overwhelming fire. The brilliance of American strategy lay not in any single weapon, but in the systematic integration of firepower across all units. The M2 Browning was ubiquitous, but it was the way it was employed within infantry squads, armored columns, anti-aircraft teams, and aircraft that multiplied its effect. Infantry squads could lay suppressive fire with heavy machine guns, while advancing tanks destroyed fortified positions. Artillery units coordinated with airstrikes to saturate enemy positions. Reconnaissance units identified German formations, which were then destroyed before they could reorganize. This was industrial warfare in action, a calculated, coordinated system that relied on volume, consistency, and logistical support. Whereas Germany focused on precision, the Americans leveraged redundancy. Every weapon system, every squad, every aircraft contributed to a network of overwhelming firepower that the Germans simply could not counter. The psychological toll on German forces. Repeated encounters with American firepower had a cumulative effect. Historian Alfred Schlemm, reflecting on his experiences, noted that by early 1945, German soldiers could identify American machine gun fire at distances exceeding 1,000 meters. The knowledge that a single .50 caliber could strike with deadly effect instilled constant fear and hesitation. This fear was not cowardice. These were highly trained soldiers who had survived the Eastern Front, fought in North Africa, and endured the brutal winters of Russia. Yet the scale and consistency of American firepower rendered even the most elite troops cautious, defensive, and increasingly ineffective. By contrast, American doctrine accepted material expenditure as a strategic advantage. Ammunition was not rationed, weapons were never scarce, and every operational unit could be resupplied within hours. This meant that even when German units found temporary success, they were quickly countered by new waves of firepower. Tanks, anti-tank warfare, and the limits of German armor. The Germans had developed formidable tanks like the Tiger I, Tiger II, and Panther, optimized for frontal engagements and tactical superiority. On paper, these machines could dominate smaller, lighter Allied tanks. In practice, they were limited by production numbers, mechanical reliability, and American logistical flexibility. The M2 Browning played a critical role here. While it could not penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor, it could destroy softer targets, disable engines, and harass crews. Half-tracks, trucks, and artillery pieces, essential components of German mobility, were highly vulnerable. Tanks became less effective when they could not rely on infantry support or logistical continuity. The M2, in combination with artillery and airstrikes, turned every German vehicle into a potential liability. The German strategic collapse. By April 1945, Germany's industrial heart had been destroyed. Transportation networks were shattered. Fuel was scarce, and morale had reached critical lows. The cumulative effect of American material superiority, the relentless use of weapons like the M2 Browning, and the integration of air, land, and armored assets left the Wehrmacht unable to mount meaningful resistance. All across Europe, German commanders noted the futility of traditional tactics against an opponent who could always outshoot, outlast, and outproduce them. Skill, courage, and doctrine could no longer compensate for a lack of industrial and logistical capacity. The M2 Browning, unglamorous yet omnipresent, became the symbol of this system. It was not merely a weapon, but a force multiplier, a psychological weapon, and a representation of the industrial might that the United States brought to bear on the battlefield. The legacy of industrial warfare, the lessons of 1944 to 1945 were clear and enduring. Material abundance can outweigh tactical skill. A weapon system does not need to be perfect. It must be reliable, supported, and plentiful. Integrated firepower is decisive, combining infantry, armor, artillery, and air assets creates synergy that exceeds the sum of its parts. Psychological pressure can shape outcomes. Soldiers fight not only against enemy troops, but against the threat of overwhelming and persistent firepower. When the last German units surrendered, it was not just a victory of strategy, it was a victory of systems, logistics, and industrial capacity. The M2 Browning, humble in appearance, exemplified that principle. 8 decades later, it still serves as a reminder that in modern warfare, production, supply, and doctrine can decide the fate of nations. By early 1945, the momentum of war had irrevocably shifted. German forces, exhausted, depleted, and facing the relentless advance of Allied troops across France, Belgium, and into the heart of Germany, confronted an enemy whose superiority was no longer measured merely in numbers or courage, but in the seamless integration of doctrine, logistics, and industrial might. The 50 caliber Browning machine gun, once a humble infantry support weapon, had become the keystone of an operational philosophy that combined firepower, mobility, and psychological dominance. During the final Allied pushes into the Rhineland and the Ruhr, German commanders frequently reported in their diaries and post-war interrogations that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome the sheer volume and reliability of American firepower. Even elite units, like the remnants of the Waffen SS and experienced Panzer divisions, found themselves constrained by the omnipresent 50 caliber. It was mounted on every available platform: trucks, half-tracks, tanks, tank destroyers, anti-aircraft vehicles, and even improvised fortifications. American doctrine emphasized suppression above precision. German forces, trained to value marksmanship and tactical economy, faced an entirely alien approach: saturate the battlefield with fire, deny movement, and force the enemy into attrition at every level. Supply lines, carefully calculated, ensured that each unit could maintain this relentless tempo. Where the Germans conserved ammunition, the Americans expended it as a strategic tool, transforming logistics into a weapon as lethal as any artillery shell. In urban centers such as Cologne, Aachen, and later the outskirts of Berlin, the M2 Browning proved indispensable. Infantry advancing behind armored columns could rely on continuous suppressive fire, clearing enemy positions in multi-story buildings and fortified complexes. German snipers and machine gunners, who would have been decisive in open terrain, were rendered ineffective. Each burst of 50 caliber fire tore through walls, floors, and roof lines, leaving defenders exposed and psychologically demoralized. Veterans later described entire sectors of cities rendered untenable not by artillery or bombs, but by the persistent, unrelenting presence of American heavy machine guns. Air power complemented ground operations seamlessly. P-47 Thunderbolts, strafing columns and fortifications with 8 M2 machine guns each, created a downward rain of steel. German ground forces learned to fear the distinct sound of these aircraft engines, a signal that devastating fire was imminent. The cumulative effect of ground and air-delivered 50 caliber fire was a force multiplier beyond anything the German military had encountered. By March and April 1945, as the Allies crossed the Rhine and encircled the Ruhr, German command recognized the futility of resistance. Tactical skill, bravery, and the vaunted discipline of veteran units could not offset an adversary who had designed warfare around overwhelming material power and inexhaustible logistics. Battles were no longer contests of maneuver or ingenuity, but exercises in survival against a system that operated on scale, reliability, and continuous fire. The fall of Berlin in May 1945 underscored this lesson. Soviet forces from the east and American forces from the west closed the net around the capital. Urban combat, which might have favored defenders with intimate knowledge of streets and fortified positions, became a showcase of American combined arms efficiency. Tanks, infantry, artillery, and air units coordinated seamlessly, with 50 caliber machine guns providing constant suppressive fire to secure every advance. German defenders found that no position offered real protection. Every building, every street, and every courtyard could be subjected to withering fire without pause. The legacy of the 50 caliber Browning extends beyond its physical impact on the battlefield. It represents the fundamental principle of modern industrial warfare, the ability to produce, supply, and deploy equipment at a scale that makes attritional resistance mathematically futile. In World War II, German forces brought skill, discipline, and tactical finesse. The Americans brought a system designed to ensure that quantity, reliability, and doctrine could always overcome localized brilliance. Even today, 8 decades later, the M2 Browning remains in service around the world, a testament to John Browning's design genius and the enduring relevance of American industrial warfare principles. The lessons learned in Normandy, the Ardennes, and across the German heartland continue to influence military strategy in conflicts where logistics, firepower, and relentless pressure converge. Even the most disciplined enemy will find themselves outmatched. The story of the 50 caliber is more than a story of a weapon. It is a story of strategy, logistics, doctrine, and human psychology. It demonstrates how a single design, mass-produced and employed universally, reshaped battlefields, demoralized experienced opponents, and contributed decisively to the Allied victory in Europe. Its legacy is a reminder that in modern warfare, systems often triumph over individuals, and that industrial might, applied intelligently, can determine the outcome of even the most heroic struggles. For those fascinated by the intersection of technology, strategy, and human endurance, the tale of the 50 caliber Browning offers lessons still relevant today. To explore more untold stories of innovation, strategy, and historical impact, subscribe and stay connected. Each story reveals not just the past, but insights into the enduring principles that continue to shape warfare and human conflict. The story of the 50 caliber Browning is more than a tale of steel and fire. It is a testament to strategy, innovation, and the relentless power of industrial warfare. From the frozen forests of the Ardennes to the streets of Berlin, this weapon shaped the battlefield and left a legacy that endures to this day. If you found this journey through history as fascinating as we did, don't miss out on our future deep dives into the untold stories of warfare, strategy, and innovation. Subscribe now and stay connected, because every story has a lesson, and every lesson deserves to be discovered.